Chuck, Russia has claimed that it recently was able to take down 40 Ukrainian drones that are headed towards Archangelisk Oblast. As you know, it's in the far north near the Arctic. The region lies roughly 1,900 kilometers or 1,180 miles away from Ukraine. It contains Plesetsk, where the Russians are testing nuclear capable Yars ICBMs. Plesetsk is also where they launch military communications and missile early warning satellites. But the smoke coming up from there confirms there was some significant damage. But Chuck, how does Russia defend a strategic site that's that far away from Ukraine?
Well, one of the big issues is it didn't think it had to. And again, I'll just underscore the geography. This is a very sensitive Soviet legacy location far in the Russian Arctic. And as you said, 1,900 miles from Ukraine. So there's one of the problems that Russian air defenders face. The target set has expanded into truly continental dimensions. So air defense protects priority zones, right? So and those are assets are allocated in a not unbroken system into what is our high priority targets. So not every point across Russia's enormous territory is going to get priority air defense. Distance was supposed to be factored into that calculation. So effective coverage, it needs to be overlapping, right? What you're always dealing with is an air defense network, a system, rather than isolated short range point defense systems. And although those are capable for slugging it out at the fence line, they work best when they have an idea when something is coming. And the other thing is, power generation used not to be a factor, but with diesel running in short supply, whether you can keep those sensors activated and rotated, it depends not so much on your electronics, but wow, your diesel supply. So these systems, they normally and already protect bomber bases, missile units, command nodes, and weapons plants. Interestingly, every one of those Venn diagram dots converged on that particular target. But sending more defenses north, I mean, that means that a priority area somewhere closer to where the war is going to get less protection. I suspect that the Russians are just like every other armed force, and that is you rush to the barn door after the horse is gone. So they'll be shifting air defense assets north, and that's a win for Ukraine, Jason, because you're literally moving these systems 2,000 miles away from where the war is. So intercepted raids, they reveal, radar activity, jamming zones, interception launchers, and response times. So a Ukrainian attack doesn't even have to be successful in order to really get some military result. But Jason, even a failed raid, right? It shows Ukraine where Russia has concentrated its defenses. Are those moving? What do you see?
I think it is interesting to see how Ukraine is playing this out because it's not like they're just going for these targets on the front line. They're going deeper. They're going for Russia's capacity to to have what it needs to fight, going after its ability to have this facility to launch satellites into space or launch ICBMs. But more than that, I think about the attack they just carried out on the Progress plant in Samara. That was one back in August 15th. Now, that for me is a great case of how Ukraine is trying to make it impossible for the Russians to wage war. That's, of course, where they produced the Soyuz launch vehicles. That's where they also made a lot of the different parts that are used, and the rockets included that are used for the military communication satellites. So when they are going after a facility like this, it's going to have a long-term effect on Russia. But even more interesting is the fact that they are going after things like Rasvet. Rasvet is intended to give Russia forces domestic alternative to Starlink. But if they don't have that, again, they're at a disadvantage. As you know, right now there's a huge conversation about whether or not Ukraine will get the capacity to use Starlink in order to carry out attacks across Russia at a longer distance. But all of this is something that is, I think, part of the brilliance of the strategy is that it's not allowing the Russians to dictate how this war will be fought. They're being pried away from things that they were counting on. Undoubtedly, their scientists had worked hard on this. They're sure that once they're able to get all their satellites in space, things will be fine. They'd have the best technology. But now it's being cut off. Now, when you look at this, what happens when we see things like progress being cut off? We see things like the Soyuz 2 rockets from Plesetsk being cut off. How does that fit into the equation?
Well, Russia has a very rich target deck. It includes every apartment building in Ukraine, full stop. Ukraine has limited resources. It has a limited precision, uh, long range precision strike capability. Ergo, it concentrates them on critical nodes within the Russian system, right? You're looking at a manufacturing node that deals with space, ICBMs, uh, propulsion, solid rocket boosters. Everything overlaps. Ukraine doesn't address superfluous targets. It doesn't address area targets in Russian cities. But Progress, it's the sole producer, as you mentioned before, of the Soyuz 2 launch vehicles. Pretty important, right? That would be like hitting the Stennis Space Center in the middle of nowhere in Mississippi, a little known place where the U.S. tests its solid rocket
Mhm.
boosters. Also, it's, all of its space engine technology is based in this little swamp town in Mississippi. So Plesetsk uses those rockets to launch military spacecraft, right, which include the new, Starlinksky system. But the space launches depend on the production, testing, transport, preparation, launch infrastructure, everything else that goes down the line. Before someone does the 3, 2, 1 blast off, there are literally tens of thousands of production steps that have to not only occur, be supplied, be quality checked, et cetera. You're dealing with space flight, and the Soviet system is littered with histories. You only get one tiny little mistake, and you have a very sympathetic target. So one disruptive stage, right? And Ukraine is great. There's a military science that overlaps into espionage. It's called target analysis, right? What do you want to achieve? What are the component, operations that make this capability, technology, whatever it is, whatever the enemy needs? You're addressing a long tail of things you can disrupt. So the satellite networks, they also need new spacecraft, right? You have to get those things up. Now, I assume that the Russian, Starlink analog is going to use smaller space vehicles, as Elon Musk has discovered. You don't have to put up the gigantic, in some cases, back in the Cold War, bus-sized satellites to do it. And one delayed launch does not necessarily blind Russia. But when you're attacking a space launch facility, Jason, as we were speaking before we went on, you don't have to break very much before you're no longer in the Cape Canaveral business, right? And repeated disruptions, they slow improvements in communications, reconnaissance, missile warning, everything else. I also like to point out whenever Russia says they shot down 40 drones approaching a target, I always double the number of attack vectors. So they shot down 40, but probably 80 were incoming. You did report battle damage assessment. Look, something big got set on fire, and there are no superfluous buildings at, a space launch facility. So they busted something. But Jason, protecting fixed sites, right? That
Right.
now carries consequences for the people who control the sites. As you
Absolutely.
talk about the vertical stroke, tell us about that in Russia.
So that's just it. As we were mentioning right before we went on, what this might mean is a bigger case. What I think is fascinating here is it's by no coincidence that Vladimir Putin on August 24th signed a decree that lets the Kremlin take control whenever it believes that critical infrastructure is being poorly protected. So what's that about? You would think, okay, well, they're just trying to protect assets that are necessary for the government to continue operating. But is it really about that? I don't think it really is about that. So in theory, a company hit by drones can therefore face both physical damage, but also the loss of control of their assets. But is that really in the state's interest? So I looked into it a little bit. And what I found was no, it's actually more of a lever over Russia's business elites. Let's remember that Russia at this point is in a very strange stage. It's seen its largest redistribution of property since the 1990s. In fact, more than $54 billion have been taken or nationalized since the beginning of the war. But let's go further. Let's look at where that's all going. Well, the major assets, they're moving to groups that are close to Vladimir Putin himself. In fact, it's over 90% of the assets have been taken. That 54 billion have ended up in the pockets of people that are personally close to Vladimir Putin, his own friends, his own supporters, guys he's known since the 1990s. So when we're seeing this, why would they want to have a law like this that right now allows the government to take away assets from key facilities? Now, how do they define that? We can be sure a facility such as the oil industry would be one that they'd be able to take. Let's imagine that you're a subcontractor, you're producing something for the oil industry or for the government, and they decide they don't have to prove they've been struck by a drone or anything. They just say that you're not sufficiently well enough prepared, and so we could seize your assets. That's really about trying to take away from the one party and give it to another party the different sorts of key assets that are across Russia right now. There's a limited number of them. Right now, there's a ton of different fighting going on within the Kremlin, within the elites, and they're all dissatisfied with each other. They're all at each other's throats. And that's why I think it's so interesting to see where this is taking it. But one of the key things that's going on here, Chuck, is what we just saw in Kamensky. And as you know, the Kamensky situation is not less than fascinating. What do you see going on over there?
Well, I'll just hark back to what you just laid out a little bit because that's fascinating to me. I'm an oligarch. I'm smoking a Havana cigar. I'm sitting there at my mahogany conference table with my feet up. And now I'm responsible for Ukrainian drone strikes. I'm not in the air defense business, dude. I'm in the 400-foot private yacht business. So Putin hands over this gift-wrapped hand grenade. There's nothing that the board or the oligarchs or any of their crooked minions can do to play whack-a-mole against where Ukraine is going to strike next. So that to me is this interesting poisoned chalice, right? Unsolvable, right? It's like telling Jeff Bezos he's got to protect all his warehouses or Washington's going to seize them all. So that's pretty interesting to me. And maybe I'm looking at, we're getting increasingly Stalin-esque, and maybe it'll end the same way with Putin laying on his bedroom floor and no one checking on him for 12 hours. But anyway, the particular place we're talking about, Kamensky, it produces solid rocket propellant, which is used across several Soviet weapons platforms. So solid rocket propellant is basically an explosive that burns at a sustained rate. Once you start off a solid rocket motor, that's it. You can't turn it off. It's going. Sometimes you can configure them in stages, so one will burn this long and then the next one. But once they go, they're going. And Ukraine says they've hit two workshops were destroyed in this latest raid and 4 more damaged. That was on August 16th. That wasn't the latest raid. And then 8 days later, they hit the target again. Now, obviously, I'm talking about solid rocket boosters where the most stable component is powdered aluminum, which, by the way, burns pretty ferociously. And once that gets going, good luck. And please, folks, visit YouTube. There was an explosion in the Nevada desert maybe 15 years ago of a rocket motor plant going up, and that will definitely rock your world. The camera was about 8 miles away when it went off, and pretty amazing. So that solid rocket propellant, it needs specialized mixing, casting, curing, inspection, and safety systems, right? So you've created this thing that can literally go off with the kind of force necessary to put something into orbit. I like to put it in psychology major terms. So you think about, wow, that's how much power this stuff has. So it requires everything to go right. So if you break a little thing, for example, you break a clean room or you mess around with the electrical supply so you can no longer be sure that no sparks are going to occur in the mixing room, et cetera. So these processes, they depend on fixed equipment, experienced workers, and the production means that can rebuild an industrial process. You can't relocate these production lines. I mean, it is not something that's going to happen that would be advantageous to Russia continuing to use, for example, a fundamental component, solid rocket motors, in this war. So hardening Kamensky, that's great, but that's only part of the system. And again, I refer to that oligarch with the cigar. What's he going to do? Send his secretary out for air defense for dummies? Air defense 101. And truly, his crocodile companions in the oligarch set, they're all dialing 1-800 give me a panseer too, right? So Putin has put these clowns in competition with each other in a realm that they know absolutely nothing, that requires not only specialist equipment that works, that is connected to an air defense network, and dare I even say, the 6 monkeys that are in the launcher and know how to work the system at a minimum. Okay, so the air defense is sent there. They're unavailable to any other target, including ground lines of communication, Russian troops approaching the zero line in Ukraine. That equipment's got to come from somewhere, and man, S goes downhill in the Russian system. So the first people who are going to suffer are the Russian soldiers on the zero line. But
Mhm.
Kamensky can't move, Jason, and the Iskander launches, which Kamensky makes the solid motors for, they survive by doing exactly that, moving. So Ukraine is hitting the component of the problem that can't be moved or even hidden.
It's pretty amazing. It is amazing once again is the fact that the Ukrainians have the intelligence on this. I guess a lot of these facilities, like some of these that we mentioned, are definitely built in the Soviet period. Undoubtedly, they were it's something that's been around for a long time. But some of the other stuff that they've come out with has been, for instance, in the drone world, the specifics that Ukraine has been able to target different things in Russia. The fact that they have eyes on that, they know exactly what's going on there, is pretty impressive. But it's something else I think is part of a larger question is that Ukraine understands very well that if it were to just try to fight what's going on the front lines alone, it's not enough. Or to quote Ben Hodges, General Ben Hodges, as he always says, it's the archer to go for, not the arrows. But at this stage, it seems like it's even more basic than that. They're going after the very facilities that are producing what's necessary. We've seen attack after attack on the logistics in Russia, going after things like ozone, going after things like wild berries. But do you think it's a shift of strategy? What do you think's going on? What do you think the Ukrainians take from here? We've seen more of this now, I think, than any other point of the war. The Ukraine's kind of attacks within Russia, going after the very specific nodes, the very tight little pieces that are necessary to keep the system working. The minute those break, a lot of things start to break behind them.
Yeah, it's a great observation. And, what we're seeing is the maturation of Ukrainian technology. Because bear in mind, I mean, heretofore, if Ukraine got its hands on a couple of Storm Shadow cruise missiles, that was almost the limit of its strike capability. And what it's done on its own, nobody would give them harpoons, so they make harpoon analogs.
Mhm.
And they were smart enough, and believe me, that Ukrainians are a lot smarter than this commentator. I will definitely hand you that. They waited until, not only can they produce these things, but they can produce them at scale, and then they start to use them. And we have seen as their deeper strike capabilities evolve, you're absolutely right, Jason, to comment on the level of intelligence, because it doesn't just mean they discovered where, Kamensky is and note that, they produce solid rocket motors. They their target deck tells me they understand the entire system, right? They understand the entire system, and they're getting commander's intent, like, I want Russia's ability to produce ballistic missiles to be depreciated by X. I'm going to give you some incremental goals, and I want you to achieve them. I want that down 5% in the first month. I want it down 20% in the third month, and I want it down 50% 6 months from now. So they're carrying out those attacks. I know I'm going just a little farther afield, but I want to remind everybody what it means when a Ukrainian precision strike munition flies over almost 2,000 miles of Russian airspace. It's not picked up by an AWACS. It's not chased down by a fighter plane. People sit in the street and go, "Meow, what was that?" for 2,000 miles as it closes in on one of the most sensitive military sites in all of Russia. Wow. I'm
Mhm.
digging it, Jason.
Mhm. No, it is very impressive. And once again, It's like we've talked about before. Ukraine, when this war started, it was not renowned for drones, nor for missiles, nor for that matter, a navy. We've seen what it's done to the Black Sea Fleet. We've seen what it's done across Russia now, and regularly across Russia, going after, example again, look at the oil industry. Oil industry is essential for Russia. Without that, they have big problems, as they're having right now. 28% of gas stations in Russia have gas. That's amazing. Something that Russia has never had a situation like this before. It's truly phenomenal. And it's by a country that just 4 years ago, I didn't have the capacity to do not anything similar to this. But Russia did have the capacity and it's losing it. So it's not just an advancing, it's being pushed back. It's not gaining Donbass. And now within Russia, it's routinely taking these beatings. And to me, I don't see any signs of them trying to curb this or turn around. Have you seen anything though that catches your attention where it looks like the Russians are trying to curb this in a new way?
Well, they are making increases in the number of ballistic missiles they produce. And in some species of their ballistic missiles, they're up like 140% since the
Hmm.
top of the war. Okay, that's great, but I still look at the Russian target set, right? They hit apartment buildings in Kyiv. They're not hitting the Flamingo factory because it doesn't exist, right? You look at one basis in Russia, you have the legacy Soviet systems, closed cities, 10 stories underground, hardened facilities that can never move, right? They are not portable. They exist with the command economy, resources, subcomponents in, finished weapons of mass destruction to finish capitalism out the other gate. That's it. Ukraine is completely the opposite. We have both seen the dispersed production facilities, the just-in-time confluence of subcomponents to make another component to move it down the line so that literally that Flamingo missile is being assembled on the launch rails and there it goes. So I make no excuses for Russia whatsoever. They are bloodthirsty murderers, but they don't have a strategic target deck on Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't offer that target. The only thing Russia can hit are these cities. So, and unfortunately, we're just going to continue to see that. And with this uptick in Russian ballistic missile productions, look, I'm afraid it's going to be a long winter in Ukrainian cities. And note to NATO allies and my own country, they need air defense, right?
Mhm.
The consequence is Ukrainian civilian deaths, which, Jason, as we both know, are already above 55,000 civilian deaths just from Russian missile strikes in this war.
No, it's pretty phenomenal. It's the Russians are carrying out this war, and I think it's pretty obvious to everybody at this point. There is no strategy to actually turn things around. It's just become this. It's terrorism. Now, within Russia, though, the good news is that the terrorism is starting to backfire. Look at the recent attacks that we just saw on Ozone, which is the competitor of Wildberries. Wildberries is the Amazon equivalent, as many people have observed. But as I've said many times, the objective here was a little bit different. It was not just about hitting Amazon. That's inconvenience. That has not changed the war. And of course, it was providing things for the military and logistics. But much more important was it was striking something that owes a ton of money, billions upon billions of dollars, to the second largest bank in the country, 20% of market share, called ATB Bank. ATB Bank was already having significant liquidity problems, significant problems with its own system. But the attacks on Ozone, here's where it gets fascinating. Something that a lot of people don't realize. Ozone is not just another competitor. It is, in fact, it had a larger distribution network than the Wildberries. So it really got down to every village across Russia. But far, far more important, if you look at who's the largest shareholder, it's a guy named Kovalchuk. Kovalchuk is the top oligarch in Russia, probably. He is considered to be the number 2 person in Russia, Vladimir Putin's closest friend. In fact, when Vladimir Putin was locked down due to COVID, he was essentially living with him. They locked down together. So Kovalchuk is an extremely close friend going back to the 1990s. They used to have dachas next to each other outside of St. Petersburg. That's a different story. But him and several of the other guys who are top people in Russia today, back in the 1990s, by chance, they were neighbors in dachas, and they decided to actually have a communal property to link all their dachas together. They formed a corporation called, translates to Lake, Ozera. And what he had that for was, well, that was the beginning of their friendship. They were such close friends. But today, all of those close friends are multi-billionaires. Why this one matters, Kovalchuk. He's the cutout for Vladimir Putin. So whenever you see his name somewhere, it really means Vladimir Putin. So when he owns something, it's Vladimir Putin's money. It's not just his money. It's Vladimir Putin's money. So when he owns Ozone, that means that it's Vladimir Putin's money. Ozone also has a bank. The bank would be very much so directly impacted by these attacks. Take it one step further, though. They also owed a ton of money to, guess what? VTB Bank again. So VTB Bank is already having problems, and now this is going to double down. To give you an idea of the scale of this, Sberbank, which is the largest bank in Russia, it's the one that's owned 50% plus one by the government. They've had over 2,000 different companies. And some of them are large companies, not all just, small companies. Over 2,000 companies come to them and say, due to the recent attacks on Wildberries, we have to ask for our debts to be restructured. We need more time, et cetera, et cetera. Well, with these new attacks, this is going to drain the economy. In fact, the stock market on Monday lost, I think, it's $15 billion just in the first few hours. The attacks have cost already, just Kovalchuk himself, just on Monday, it was estimated that he lost, I want to say it's about $750 million just himself through the one attack on this Ozone. So we take a step further. What's that all mean in the big picture? Well, he also owns Первый Канал, which is the first channel. It's the propaganda channel. He also owns Bank Rossiya. He owns a number of things, but even more interesting. And nobody else reported on this. I was doing a lot of research, though, on this topic. What he also owns is the reinsurer. He insures the central bank. And where that gets interesting, central bank set apart $1.9 billion to help with the cost of drone attacks. So far, there's about $95 billion of damage. So I don't think it's going to be nearly enough to cover all that cost. So what do? You go to your insurance company. You think the insurance company's got sort of money sitting around? They don't. This is going to be a catastrophe. This is going to be personal bankruptcy for Vladimir Putin's pal over here. Now, I'm sure he's structured in such a way that it will not literally be personal bankruptcy. It will be the major problems of various of his corporations. But it's also a turning point in the war because now it's attacking Vladimir Putin's interest on a personal, direct level. This is not just, an oil refinery burns, people don't have fuel. It's not him that's feeling the heat of that. But to give you an idea of how much he doesn't feel the heat from that, the Minister of Energy, his name Novak. He is a relative of Vladimir Putin's. His wife is the second cousin of Putin, if I recall, but she's the deputy minister for the military. But anyways, they asked him recently, I try to remember her exact title. I can't remember for the life of me, but but when you look at the Minister of Energy himself, he was recently asked in an interview, what do you make of all the gas shortages in Russia? He said, I drive a diesel and there's no problem with diesel whatsoever, which is not the case. There's no diesel anywhere. And so he got a lot of, negative press about that statement from those who are in the independent media, not the government media, obviously. But then there's interesting is now he has had to admit that, yes, there are some sort of problems that are occurring right now. And even Putin had to just say, also, I guess it was on Monday or so, he had to say that there are certain problems that have not yet been resolved in regards to gas within Russia. The fact is, it's the first time he's really ever said that. Earlier, he just said that there's little hiccups or some problems, but he never really started to talk about it. Now he's realizing that this problem is becoming really big. Where it becomes problematic for Vladimir Putin, why would you make your own relative the guy who's in charge of things like dealing with natural resources? Because he's supposed to take a percent. That's his job. That's why you put him there. Why do you put your cousin in charge of things like part of the military? It's her job to take a percentage for you, which is fascinating. There's about 45% of their budget is from the revenues that are coming from the selling of oil and gas. That's one relative. Her husband, his wife is in charge of one section of the military, which is about 45% of expenditures. So on the money coming into the government, he takes a cut. And the money going out of the government takes a cut. On both sides, they're taking a cut. It's Vladimir Putin's personal family that's self-enriching from this in a level that's extraordinary. Go a little bit further. So when we're looking at these attacks right now that Ukraine is taking right now across Russia, carrying out across Russia, it's about a lot more than just these strategic sites. I mean, I think it's very important, undoubtedly very important what's going on. These attacks we just saw in Arkhangelsk, these attacks that we see on the different facilities. But I think it's even more important, the attacks that Ukraine is carrying out on these key parts of the logistics network that is vis-a-vis Wildberries, vis-a-vis Ozone. But more important is the economic impact of this. This is going to change how Vladimir Putin sees this war because it's no longer a distant thing. It's not a thing that's hypothetical or the government's money. It's the government's money. It's nobody's money. Just do whatever you want with it. This is his money. And that's a lot less fun when it's your money that's burning. I think that could be very well something that will change the calculus of the war for Putin.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And it brings me back to the elegance of Ukrainian intelligence. Look, they looked at these corporations and, I am sure they came to the same determination that you did, that, this is a Putin money-making scheme, which is really sort of amazing. You've got a country at war, so you're making a cut on every bean, bullet, and Band-Aid that gets used, right, in its production. Then you also take a cut as it's going out. It's nefarious, and then you're into these two big distribution hubs, which we have seen, and they play a not inconsiderable part in the distribution of war materials, right? Lithium batteries, thermal cameras, little things that every civilian needs, like an aerodynamically shaped container with 30 kilometers of fiber optic cable in it. You got three of these right here. I mean, they're useful for attack drones. But, I wonder, Jason, though, and I always like bringing it back, into your wheelhouse in Russia. I talk a lot about military incompetence, resource wasting on the battlefield. And all of that, I can point to an entire generation of military idiots, right? These guys are absolutely, completely unqualified for the job. We know they're crooks. But I don't know that I really appreciate not only the staggering level of corruption here, but it seems to me that this is an industrial military complex that is leaking money everywhere, and it's all going into one bloody purse. How long can you keep up a system like that with that staggering amount of corruption mounted on the incompetence of the Russian military class?
Oh, that's a good question. The fact is, it can't go on forever. And I think that's where we really get down to the trick here is that Putin has a system that works as long as there's money. And someone has any illusions about how this all functions. I think the biggest misunderstanding about the war of many of the things that are misunderstood, but one of the key things that's misunderstood is to really imagine that it had any other purpose than self-interest of Vladimir Putin. And why I would argue that is that you can look at ultimately who's the ultimate beneficiary of various actions. So when we look at the war, we can say that it's about language, or it's about denazification, or it's about keeping them out of NATO, or demilitarization. We have a long list of things. Now, interesting enough, is Kovalchuk is the person who's a very big proponent of that. Apparently, he was really talking about that a lot when he was locked away with Putin during COVID. But there's something they leave out about that. To give you an idea of how much I'm sure that's not the reason, Kovalchuk is somebody who is trying to find out a way to make money. He is somebody who himself, his mother, his mother is Jewish. His father is from Ukraine. He's Ukrainian. He would not be a typical Russian nationalist. He is far away from typical of what you would look for. But why would he have an interest in this? Well, this allowed him to consolidate power over a lot of different things. We saw a lot of money start going into the military industrial complex, something that benefits him. The propaganda that's going on in Russia, it directly benefits him. The various programs they're coming out with right now, he's the one administering them. When you're making money from this, and we're talking hundreds of millions worth of money in this, that explains a lot better for me what it's really about than saying, it was about ideology. Ideology undoubtedly is a very useful tool because the population, they're not going to go join a war because you're going to make a lot of money. That doesn't really excite them. But when you explain it for some sort of a greater purpose, ideological purpose, it makes it more palpable. Now, why do you think that they're so defensive about people that say that the war is not about, fighting for freedom of Donbass or whatever they phrase it as? The reason they're so touchy about that subject is because if people realize that it's really about the financial interests of some elites, it becomes a lot less interesting quickly. Now, there's something else that's been triggered by this that's really worth paying attention to. Kovalchuk is somebody who is, as I said, one of the most powerful people in Russia. He's incredibly important, but he's not good friends with those that are coming from the other oligarchical clans. Sechin, for instance, who's in charge of oil, He's from the intelligence clan. The guys are KGB. And people might wonder, why doesn't Putin just side all the time with the KGB clan or side over here with the Kovalchuk clan? Because that is his own money. That's a good question. And there's reason for it. Vladimir Putin believes that his strongest suit, the way he can best protect himself from coups and other problems, is to never allow anybody to feel too comfortable. Even his own friends, which these are his own friends, he doesn't ever want them to feel that they really have, Putin around their finger, that Putin is really controlled by them or by their interest. They all have to believe that Putin has to be fought for. And if he has to be fought for, and he's the cornerstone, or I should say the keystone for all this pressure that's mounting, it means that nobody can really do away with Putin because he's necessary to keep everything from falling apart. The problem is that today, it is already falling apart. Already, different factions are being liquidated. We see Shoigu's faction, for instance. He's a former minister of defense. 6 or 7 of his former deputies now have been arrested, are in prison, or on their way there. That's a liquidation of a faction. The other factions, and there's actually multiple factions within Russia, so I won't go into micro detail. These other factions are trying to figure out what they can do right now to self-enrich as best as they can. And why is it right now Russian military officers don't want to see an end to the war? Because this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make money. They are making incredible sums of money at the higher levels with contracts, at the lower levels with bartering their goods into the black market. It's a money-making opportunity for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. But when we look at what it is on the elite level, they are looking at this as an opportunity to liquidate Kovalchuk and his gang. Kovalchuk has already lost their different assets, actually, already to the FSB gang. Vladimir Putin doesn't want to really stand up to the FSB gang either. He wants to keep them close. If they get too upset with him, they could definitely get rid of him. It would not be hard at all. So he has to make sure that they are kept appeased. But he doesn't want them to feel that he's too controlled by them, that he's too much under their influence. And so Kovalchuk, he gets to win some of the battles. Putin is like the referee, is the best way to describe it. He's a referee between these different groups who are at war. And these different groups who are all out there seeking what's best for them. Nobody's interested in what this means for Russia, what this is going to mean for the protection of Russia as a whole. They're interested in, how does this help me today to make more money? Now, when you're doing with that, and you're doing with a military that has this reverse logic, or I should say the correct term would be perverse incentive is the correct term. Perverse incentive, where all of a sudden you're not incentivized to win a war. You're not incentivized to necessarily take territory. Your incentive from the way it's structured is to make sure that your boss looks good. And your boss looks good when, 1, you report back that things are great, but 2, you help him steal as much money as you possibly can from the military. So when you set up a system that's going to function this way, no matter what, that's why we end up with things like the Prigozhin uprising we've discussed before. And it's one of my favorite moments is, where were those officers? Where were these generals in Rostov? They see Prigozhin's on the way there. They didn't call in to air raid. They didn't call in an airstrike on him. They didn't try to arrest him. They sat and drink coffee with him in the street. Why is that? Hey, man, I'm just a general. I'm here to direct the war in Ukraine. That's my job. When it comes to somebody trying to overthrow the government, nobody ever told me that was my job. I'm not going to get involved in that. That could work out badly. How if this guy comes to power? What's he going to do to me? I better not get in the way. Be polite with him. And it's actually sort of funny the way they spoke to him. It's very suggestive. It's not such a great idea to do this. Maybe that's not what you want to be doing. And I say, can you imagine you're trying to violently overthrow the government? You're taking vehicles with you to go do it, armed men, and you're sitting there, politely suggesting he refrain from that president if he wishes to. They might want to consider that option. To me, that's sort of amazing. But I think that shows that why there's not just a breakdown in the Russian military. It's not purely incompetence. There's definitely a lot of incompetence. But there's also an incentive to have incompetent people. Do you really want competent people around you who are inspecting what you're up to or asking questions? Why do we just buy all this stuff and now we're going to load it to the back of a truck and it's going off in the night somewhere? Well, what's the point of that? We don't have enough supplies. Why are they sending it somewhere else? Do you really want competent people around for that?
Well, and on the uprising, you and I reported hourly on that. And one of the first things we both commented on, nobody stopped him. He even said what he was going to do. I'm going to Moscow and kick some butt. Not one person, not a general, not a private, not a corporal, nobody did anything except open the road barriers and go, woohoo. And I know this was a while ago, but that sent a signal that I think everyone needs to remember. Nobody lifted a finger to protect Vladimir Putin. And there's a couple people who have never forgotten that, and one of them is Vladimir Putin. And it's funny, yesterday was the anniversary of Prigozhin's airplane hitting an unscheduled bird at 45,000 feet or whatever happened there. But it definitely wasn't shot down by a heat-seeking missile fired. No, actually, I don't think it was hit by a heat-seeking missile. It was too high. I think it was hit by a radar-guided surface-to-air missile. But there again was the magic that we had this whole puppet show of Prigozhin going to Belarus and going into timeout. But between the time of the putsch being called off and Prigozhin getting on that airplane, there were at least a dozen meetings between him and Putin in person. I believe that's what we call the rope-a-dope, right? And I'm very interested, as you just pointed out, with Putin playing these factions against each other. Look, he was a spook. He was like a JV guy. He got sent to Eastern Germany instead of London or Oslo or Reykjavik or anywhere else. But he goes to the brutal section of the Soviet asset handling playbook. Make sure your assets, whoever they are, people you're dealing with, everyone's an asset except you, make sure they know they're hanging by a thread. Make sure there are 2 or 3 direct competitors with this person, and periodically remind them for the encouragement of others by cutting someone else's thread. And they can see what happens. What really gets to me, Jason, is how little Putin has actually evolved. I mean, you and I have both known people in the business, and they change over 20 or 30 years, right? Putin never got out of the leg-breaking stage, right? He never had a chance to go, to Middlebury or the Kennedy School of Government and get a little higher and look down and get a bigger picture. He's still at the point where breaking your fingers is how I'm going to start off, and then a power drill on your knee, we're going to work up from there. But that's a system that can't last, Jason. If Stalin couldn't make it work, if Pol Pot couldn't make it work, if Saddam Hussein couldn't make it work, I don't expect things to fall apart tomorrow, but I don't think this is long-term survival.
No,
Do
it's
I make
not.
up Russian character?
It's not a Russian character. It likes to suffer, apparently. No, I think that there's a huge misunderstanding about the general nature of how Russia's function. And it's something, by the way, to be fair to them, it's not very new. It's the way it's always been. Down to the Tsarist period, it's changed. It has definitely changed over time. I know people love history that watch our program, and so I don't want to be inaccurate. It has changed. It has not. It is, though, much more similar to itself 150 years ago than most countries were to itself 150 years ago, I would argue. And the argument the way I would highlight that is that there's very few countries, very few. I mean, none in Europe, none, not in North America, that have something like feudalism anymore. Feudalism as a system is probably the best way to describe Russia today. And a lot of people have said that it's neo-feudalism. And I think that's a very reasonable way to describe it. The reason I would argue that it really is consider this, is that Vladimir Putin is like the prince, right? Remember, there was a period of time before there were states per se or governments organized on a national level. It became what we see as, a territory and a country within it and operates with a constitution. Before all this, there was a prince, there were these territories. And you have a guy who's in charge of it. Now he's got to manage a large swath of land. He has to have various other people with whom he works to be able to achieve that. And those are going to be the local fiefdoms, the local power brokers across the thing. And typically it would work, there's various ways, but typically it might work along the lines that as long as you pay tribute, pay some money, pay some percent every year back to the capital, you'll be okay. You'll be allowed to keep operating. Nobody's really going to get in your way. If you try to rebel, that creates a problem. Now, what we saw, though, in Russian history is that there were times that they rebelled. All of a sudden, they were dissatisfied. And they would get together against the Tsar or against the leader, the prince, and they would try to eliminate him. That happens a lot in history, quite often. But in the case of Russia today, it has not distanced itself much from that. We have various different people. Let's look at The guys who are in charge of the intelligence services, who are in charge of not just intelligence and all the black market stuff they do, but oil industry. They're very tied to the oil industry specifically. So a lot of that money is going to be going into their pockets. Now, they've got their little fiefdom over here. You don't mess with their fiefdom. That is their territory. Everyone's clear as to who owns that. Now, they have other ones who are in charge of other areas. People who are out in Eastern Russia who have something like the lumber corner on the lumber market. That might be specific to them. Nobody touches it. But they are also allegiant to the prince because of it. They're not going to touch Putin. Putin allowed them all to divvy up, to take what they wanted, as long as they did their job. They didn't, create problems for Moscow. And they don't have the total fleecing they really try to avoid. And it is accurate, I think, to say that one thing that makes it sort of interesting is if you look at Moscow as an example, Moscow as a city is massive, right? Massive, 20 million people or so in the greater area. When you look at the city of Moscow, they have built incredible numbers of metro stops in the past 20 years. The streets are in excellent condition. They really effectively take care of snowfall when it happens. It functions like a normal city, only better than many cities. But why is that? Because the mayor understands he has a job, and his job is to make Vladimir Putin happy. What the voters think, that's just secondary. But the way he makes them happy is to show that, listen, things are wonderful here. It's like Dubai. Everything just works perfectly on time. It's great. But as a result of that, he also takes a percentage of everything. He takes a percentage of the contracts, every business that's coming in there. Every last deal has got his name on it. But he has to be reasonable. Because the minute that he shows that he's become unreasonable, that he's just embezzled all the money that was meant to pave the streets are in bad condition, and people are complaining, it's his end. Putin doesn't need him anymore. Putin then says, you've become a liability for me. I've given you your little fiefdom. You can plunder all you want, but you can plunder up to the point that now you're starting to destabilize what was a working city, and you're making it a city that no longer functions. And we got to have a capital that functions well. That's actually, and it's obviously not endorsing the system. I'm stating, though, it is considered to be a functioning system, though, in sociology. And why it's functioning is because it works. It produces a result. It doesn't mean it's a healthy one. It doesn't mean it's the one that you want to have. But is it functioning? Yeah, I mean, they pave the streets every year. Vladimir Putin, though, was able to set that up for all these different things. But that requires, again, to have money come in. The reason I'm allegiant to him is because I get money, I expend that money, and I take a percent. But if I don't have any money to expend, it doesn't look so good. City of Moscow just made a 20% cut to all the healthcare for the city. If you look at the other cities in Russia, some of the oblasts, actually, entire states, 60-something% cuts to healthcare. Now, when you look at a 60% cut, that's going to be substantial. I mean, I don't know specifics of what they were cutting, but imagine you go to the clinics and everything else. What would you cut when you walk in the hospital 60% of? It's not going to be a lot of fat. It's not an administrative cost. It's going to be cutting doctors. It's going to be closing down, less hours. And people start to feel that. And then people are upset. And then people are upset at the local governments. And the local government knows that they have to keep the people somehow happy, because if they're not happy, then they complain and they get blamed for what's going on. But really, they're not to blame. The fact is oil revenues are down. It's a disaster across the country. Why that gets interesting? Mobilization is coming. Who's in charge of mobilization in Russia? Guess what? It's actually the local level. What they're doing right now is they're collecting already the list of who's going to be mobilized. Looks like 500,000 to 1.5 million people. Of that, they're actively working on putting together those lists. In fact, Wall Street Journal just had an article about this as well. They're already doing everything they can to get this ready. But if that's being administered at the local level, the local authorities are already saying, hey, we got a problem. We're not going to have enough money to keep this going. We're going to really have to get something. We're going to somehow have to subsidize this. Moscow, can you subsidize this? Guess what? They can't. Out of Russia's so-called 85 different regions, I say so-called because some of them are occupied territories, but out of those, if you look at the numbers, 72 of them are already in red for the year. They don't have enough money to finish the year. So how are they going to keep doing this and then pay bonuses to people joining the military and pay for getting all these people into the military and transporting them when there's only 28% gas at gas stations? When the fact is today that things like diesel have astronomically high prices, they can't. Then all of a sudden Putin has become a problem, because remember, the prince, that is Putin, he's there to allow you to manage your fiefdom. But your job is to make sure he gets what he wants. But now you're shifting your problems onto him, the guy who's at the local fiefdom level. And he's saying, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to resolve these problems that you back in Moscow created? This isn't helping me. You made these problems. You're the reason we don't have gasoline. What do I have to do with the fact that refineries are burning? I didn't send the Ukrainian drones here. You sending soldiers into Ukraine is what brought them there. That is actually happening. And the reason we know it's happening is because they write about it. We know that because already there's different signals and there's already been enough leaks and things, which of course governors try to cover up and hide because if that becomes too well known, bad things happen. Look when we had the invasion by Ukraine of Russia back when they took part of Belgorod region, they took part of Kursk region and others. Famously, the governor, former governor of Belgorod, I'm sure we've discussed this before, but as you know, I went to Kursk, Russia with the Ukrainian troops as they were administering their occupation. Fascinating period of time. But one of the things you notice when you got to the Russian side, and I saw with my own eyes, so I could testify it's true, is that they put a ton of different dragon teeth down. The sort of pyramid-shaped things that are supposed to stop trucks or vehicles from passing through. Fascinating part was it is true what I read on Telegram. They're supposed to be quite large, of course, to stop these. They were this big. I mean, they were really this big. And I was thinking, I could go over there with a bicycle. I don't think it would really slow me down that much. It'd be a bump, but it wouldn't stop me. And if it's not going to stop me, it's certainly not going to stop a tank. So when you're thinking, what was going on down there? Well, guess what? Corruption. You're allowed, once again, to steal. You take a percentage. No problems whatsoever. But look at the governor of Kursk region. It's estimated $65 million was stolen. And where he was supposed to be doing? He's supposed to be contracting more of those dragon teeth. What happened instead? He put all the money in his pocket and said, instead of making the big ones, those cost us $10, we can make the little ones for $2. And it leaves us $8 each because then we'll produce the 20,000 of these things we're supposed to make. Great idea. Up until the moment that you actually have to use those dragon teeth, and then you got a problem. And that's why we see the former governor of Belgorod in deep trouble. We see the former governor of Kursk having to an untimely end with 2 shots to the back of the head. That was, of course, done by his own hands, undoubtedly. So when you see these sorts of things occurring, it's signs of the larger picture. It's a breakdown of this entire feudalistic system that Putin had created, that he maintained. And today, though, it really is reaching trapping point. Because again, some of the boyars can enrich themselves at the very, very top, Kovalchuk or someone else like this. But the other ones, the hundreds of other ones, dozens of other ones, they're being gobbled up right now by the others. And there's some point, though, that you realize we better not allow this to continue, because if it does, the whole system is going to break. Putin, though, he seems to be making one bad decision, one bad call after another. And I was going to ask you, Chuck, what you've seen is, but first I want to remind everyone to make sure to subscribe, to like this video, and also check out the Substack in the first pinned comment. Chuck and I put together a Substack article for almost all of our videos, and then there's citations, footnotes, and everything else. You can check it out, read it, and get more in depth on what we're discussing. But Chuck, I was going to ask you, though, when you look at things like this, the preparedness of the Russian military, when we saw like the Kursk offensive, for instance, when Ukraine rolled in there, the Russians seem to be totally taken aback by that and shocked. Did you see that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a failure of intelligence and analysis at a lot of levels. Ukraine had, a wide variety of places they could have struck. Ukraine is very good. Before you do any sort of offensive action, you want to make sure that you have controlled as many of the variables and the preconditions necessary to make your attack successful. That's war college talk for you want to hit the enemy where he's weakest, right? And not just where there are the fewest guys on the ground. The place they could have a lot of people up front, but you've learned that their logistics are completely screwed up, right? You learn that there's corruption. You've got overhead imagery that realizes, yeah, there are 60,000 dragon's teeth, but they are scale model dragon's teeth. They're this big. And to go back and revisit that just for a second, there were videos coming out at the time where my good friend was in Kursk without any body armor. I'm never going to get tired of saying that. But it showed a Ukrainian tank hitting one of those dragon's teeth at full speed where it turned into powder, because it wasn't made out of reinforced concrete. It was made out of plaster of Paris. Right. So, yeah. So there, and this circles back to what we were talking about before. The corruption, it isn't just corruption, it's rot, right? The whole system is not made out of mahogany, it's made out of wormwood, and it's completely falling apart. So we're looking at, and it's coming up. I mean, United Russia will be returned with a 90% mandate. The mobilization will go ahead, Jason, but right? How are they going to do that? The local governments don't have any money. I get mobilized, and what's to prevent me and 300 of my friends that they're trying to shove on 10 buses? And we say, why am I getting mobilized? Where's my 100,000 rubles? Why do
Yeah.
I have to do this for free? What's going on? And we talked about the great capacity of suffering that the Russian people have. This might finally be the bridge too far. And remember, you have to bring these men together. They are a commodity after all. They've got to be shipped to the front. But as you push these groups together, and they are not yet under military control, right? They're civilians with a dozen cookies mom made and a duffel bag with civilian clothes in it and a toothbrush. And they get together and they're not digging this. Wow. And the farther away this happens from the centers of power, St. Petersburg and Moscow, 20 million people in Moscow. I mean, that's a significant chunk of Russia's population. You know, there isn't really any kind of analog in the United States, with the exception of the northeastern corridor, say from, Washington to Boston. But even that doesn't do it any justice at all. I mean, they're Moscovites with they identify with that one space. But Jason, what could be done if these draft riots start breaking out in Siberia? You know, scattered places all over the world. We talked about the scarcity of air defense. We're talking about the scarcity of loyal, capable Russian troops who are willing, loyal, capable, willing to put down local disturbances. Does Rosguardia play a role in this? Are they mostly in Moscow? What's going to happen in Vladivostok if there's draft riots?
Oh, what's going to happen with a lot of stock? So the fact is that there's a few different things that could happen. Now, one is the most likely places to actually have riots will be the ones that are actually already most destabilized. Look at Chechnya, for instance. We already see significant problems there. We see that it's already having stability questions, and it's the least drafted part of the country. In fact, they have the lowest per capita number of people who've been killed in action in the course of the war. That's sort of amazing because the Chechens like to pride themselves on being the big fighters, but they're not really going off the front so much. Now, Putin's probably okay with that because there's enough problems in Chechnya. He doesn't want to upset the dish any more than it already is. But when you think about what happens in the other parts of the country, yes, you have people like Rosguardia, the National Guard, 350,000, 400,000 troops under Viktor Zolotov, the former bodyguard of Vladimir Putin. He used to work for a company called Escort Russia, but back in the 90s. But when he was back then a mafia enforcer and bodyguard, he was, never probably dreaming the day be in charge of such a massive number of soldiers. These soldiers, their primary job is to go around and to inspect, oddly enough, you should bring them up actually, is to inspect things like critical infrastructure. And that's interesting. Who were we just talking about? The new law signed on the 24th that now, if your critical infrastructure is not being kept up well enough, that the government can take it away from you. Who is in charge of that? No other than Viktor Zolotov. Now, Viktor Zolotov is somebody who's definitely an insider. He's got tanks, quite literally, in Moscow to put down any sort of rebellions for Putin. But now he's supposed to be going out and trying to inspect all these different facilities across Russia. Now, I'm not going to not recall off the top of my head how many facilities they inspected during the last report, but I want to say it was about a dozen, more or less, give or take about a dozen. So we're not talking a huge number. Given how many soldiers he has, you'd expect a lot more inspections. But the total amount out of all the facilities they checked, which is like in the energy industry and stuff like that, out of all of the facilities that they inspected, I think that not one of them came out clean. All of them came up with multiple infractions. But the total value of all the fines that they administered was only about $2,000. So why so little? Undoubtedly, they're taking bribes to make sure that nothing would happen to their facility. But there's another part of this as well. This means that they are more engaged in these sorts of exercises, taking bribes, shaking people down, than they probably are actually involved in things such as making sure that there's no riots in the streets. How likely are riots? Well, listen, it's more likely than people believe. We've seen before in Russia, actually just last year in Dagestan, or a year before last, sorry, is in Dagestan, when they took over the airport, the local Dagestanis, and tried
They
to
did.
set fire to a number of things. They stopped flights from coming in. They started a number of violent encounters with people arriving. I'll be careful of my word choice so we don't get censored. But there was a lot going on that was not part of the playbook of what they want to see in Moscow. That's part of something bigger. That's part of the fact that within Russia, there is a lot of tension that is hidden. A lot of people don't see it. But the biggest tension will probably be what the mobilization does to destabilize businesses. Once again, we're going back to these feudal lords. I've got my businesses, I've got my region over here, things are great. But now I'm getting a lot of flack that they're mobilizing people. They're calling people up to the military, and now the businesses are collapsing. The guys who support me to be the governor or mayor, now I'm having problems because of this. And this creates a bad situation. When these people start to have more and more problems, it does trickle up. They all have their Krisha or their roofs back in Moscow, the people who look out for their interests. So back in Moscow, they're calling them saying, we got more and more problems. Now, Vladimir Putin himself, how he would react to this, I mean, they would never directly tell Putin they have problems. You never tell Putin there's problems. Everything is great all the time, which is the first problem. Because of that, because of the fact that nobody can actually address any problems, we have to go through this entire show. That's where you can start to have significant problems. We start to see festering problems where it gets worse and worse and worse. National Guard isn't showing up, or they don't have the capacity to show up very quickly and to do anything useful because they're not trained for that. They're trained to put down to put down people like Shoigu if he tries to lead and overthrow the government, or if there's a Prigozhin 2.0. That's what their job is. They're there to go extract bribes from the energy industry. They're not there to actually go, do something useful like a National Guard would normally do in countries. That's not what their job is. So when they actually have to meet that, I think that's where you start to see the real possibility of them doing something stupid you will regret, like opening fire on civilians. You only have to do that a couple times to really upset populations. Why that gets interesting in the case of Russia is because it's a tinderbox. The place can easily blow up. And it is truly much, much more complicated than we give it credit for. It is a total mess. It is a powder keg. So when that happens, how that leads to something else, and I cite the example if anyone doubts, look back at the Russian Revolution, look at the value of Bloody Sunday. It was up until Bloody Sunday where the people of Russia, the average person, there's no polling, but it looked to be a reasonable narrative that we often hear in the history of Russia, that up until that moment, the peasants believed that Vladimir Putin, that Tsar Nicholas II was in fact a good czar. The boyars, the feudal lords, are the bad guys. But Tsar Nicholas II, he's a good guy. He's not informed. He doesn't understand how much we're suffering. Once he understands that this war, World War I, is causing us so much pain, then he'll come to our side. He will then undoubtedly understand our plight and try to, improve the situation for us. What happened? Well, the czars decided to open fire on these people in a procession. And their procession, by the way, led by an Orthodox priest, was the front row were people holding icons, but the guy front and center was holding a portrait of Tsar Nicholas II. So when you open up fire on these people who are showing their loyalty to the Tsar and their belief that he is anointed by God to be leading Russia, and you open fire on these people, it's not going to engender a lot of love from the masses. From there on out, things just got worse, which is usually a safe bet in Russian history. If you ask what happened then, and then it got worse. So there's a situation that Vladimir Putin, and I think that's typically the way that history works out. I mean, just as a general rule, if you have to make a rule, it's usually the unexpected moments. Remember 2011, when we saw the Arab Spring start off. Who would have guessed? The seller out in the market set himself on fire, and all of a sudden, it starts off something that affects a multitude of countries all at one time. And there's this underlying tension that was there. Or as Lenin would say, the spark had been set. In that case, quite literally. But in this case, what we see is that there was a situation that the population was already tense. It was already dissatisfied. And the moment that something was able to unite them against the government, they came out for it. In the case of Russia today, these protests that could break out or these rebellions against government, super real. I just saw a few days ago, there is more and more coming out from the radical organization within Russia. It's called Black Spark. Black Spark is, I follow them on Twitter. It's amazing to watch what they're producing. You can see how many different trains they're setting fire to in Russia. Once again, you'll never see this in the press. You can look at the videos for your own eyes. You can see what they're setting fire to. It's not a question, it's happening. It's happening across Russia. And it's happening a lot across Russia. People don't notice it. Look at the hacking in Russia. Routinely, there's hacking of major facilities across Russia including the FSB being taken offline for weeks. We saw the Russian stock exchange taken offline by hackers. For days, people couldn't log in. Think about that. We saw, hacking of major banks in Russia, the leaking of all their information, including the third largest bank in the country. We've seen one attack after another, including on Roscosmos, which charges satellite stuff, but also attacks on things such as different military units. The Russian government never says anything, part of the norm. They never admit that they've been hacked. But you can go, once again, you go to FSB's website, and what do you notice? Guess what? It doesn't come up. It comes up with an error message. That happens a lot in Russia. But who's behind that? Quite often, more often than not, I would argue, it's people within Russia that are doing it. It's not the Ukrainians, it's Russians. And that's, I think, the stunning part. And, it's sort of funny. I've asked Ukrainians about that before. I said, I think that's actually by itself fascinating. And, what is the perspective of that? And they said, it's hard to believe it's true, but yeah, it seems like it's mostly the Russians just doing it themselves. Their own people rebelling against the system. Their own people going against the government they think is actively working against them. And I think we'll see more of that sabotage, though, specifically where things like hacking, things like the financial sabotage in the coming weeks, as a class that's most likely to be pulled off the military are going to be people that are coming from the educated workforce. And they're the only ones that have not been as much affected by this war. So you have more of these computer guys, more geeks that understand how to do destruction on the web. And the destruction that hackers do, that could be billions of dollars of attacks. And unlike, attacking a wild berries or an oil refinery that burns, nobody really notices it. But trust me, the Russian government, it feels that burn.
Well, it's interesting. You and I have both studied the sort of dynamics, military, political, sociological, that happen before and during an unscheduled governmental change. And, those fields of endeavor go from everything to a tiny capital of a third world nation that no one's heard about. Interesting though, because there's the concentration of power there, whether we're talking about Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and then in a different universe, the concentration of power, means of production, political, cultural, everything else, for example, in Moscow. And what was interesting to me, and we were talking about what's Rosguardia going to do, and what's the plan if and inevitably when there is pushback about this mobilization, and especially the bigger it is, the farther reaching it is, there's going to be like problems. And especially that golden moment where someone is still a civilian, considers themselves still a civilian, they're not under military discipline. Like I say, those last 5 steps to the bus, right? That's the point at which these guys realize, look, if I get on that bus, I'm dead. Okay, but
Absolutely.
here was interesting to me about Rosguardia. So there, Putin looks at his lifetime bodyguard, and by the way, folks, not a guy who went through the Secret Service or Department of State VIP protection course. Look, this guy is a guy with a, as my mother used to say, like this. Look, he's a leg breaker, man. He didn't, he didn't go to the same school I went to protect dignitaries. This guy's a leg breaker, right? But all of a sudden, he's a whatever he is, a 4-star general, and start look, and that always works when you take a thug and you give him, the Legion of Merit and a bunch of ribbons and a funny hat. That always works out. But here's that we talk about that dynamic going on in the capital city. Okay, Rosguardia, it's in a safe pair of hands as far as Putin's concerned. This guy's a leg breaker. He's buried bodies with me. Everything's groovy. He goes around and face it, it was an enforcement activity. He's looking at these infrastructure items and he's there for the boss. And the boss is basically saying, I need a tiny excuse and I'm going to take all your toys away. But these guys go in and deal with these infrastructure owners, oligarchs, and what do? They come to an accommodation regarding $2,000 worth of fines. Here's where my SEAL brain goes off. These people were no longer adversarial. This is no longer the boss's goon army. They came to an accommodation. Okay? Sociology now. There was a dialogue. There was a transaction. There were expectations, they were met. And what did they do? They basically said, you got $2,000. Okay, push comes to shove. Those same guys are ordered to what? Seize that refinery, that airport, that what? What happened to all the dialogue? And remember what happened in the Gorbachev counter coup. The hardliners push the button. It's go time. We're taking Moscow back.
Mhm.
That fizzled, right? And it fizzled way before Yeltsin did the most noble thing he ever did in his life, and then it was over. Stand on top of that armored personnel carrier in front of the White House and say, "Not on my watch, baby." That glorious moment we all thought, wow, Russia's going to rejoin the community of nations. But Jason, let's talk coup. Let's talk change of power. Let's talk your great perspective on what is the Russian dynamic. Am I a crazy seal who's overthrown too many governments? No, not that I did, folks.
There is certainly, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's nothing I would disagree with. The fact is that we have to look at these different organizations, these different people, I should say. They're not none of them are motivated by what's going to be good for Putin, what's going to be good for Russia. They're all motivated by what's good for me today. Today, I mean, quite literally today. What's going to happen tomorrow? What this means in the long term? It's not nearly as interesting of a question. Nobody really wants to deal with that because making money today, it means it's something I can be sure of. I mean, if I put money in my bank account today, it's there tomorrow. But what's going to happen in 6 months? Highly unpredictable. There's a lot of different fish in this pond, and everybody has their own interest. So, what do I have to do to make sure that I am preserved? Now, when you're having sort of short term thinking, you're not thinking strategically, you're not thinking long term, and you're certainly not thinking the interest of the state. What does that mean? What means that you are going to probably be more risk accepting, not risk adverse, but you're willing to dive into the deep because you got a little to lose. Most people, I think, in Russia, the elites at least today, from everything we can see, from the numbers of them leaving the country, the economic problems that are happening, nationalizations that are happening, I think there's a lot of them who are looking at the situation saying, ultimately, listen, this is not going to work out well. This house of cards is eventually going to start tumbling. I don't want to be around to hold the bag when that happens. So I can do to get my money out of this country, first loot whatever I can as fast as I can. But then aside from looting everything, how can I get all of my money out as fast as possible? I think we're seeing a lot of that occur right now. But again, it raises a question. So who exactly is over here worrying about what happens in Russia? Who's going to make sure that the whole thing doesn't collapse on Putin? There's nobody looking out for that anymore. I think that Putin is probably the least guarded man in Russia. And probably, I would argue further, he's probably the weakest he has ever been. I don't think there's ever been a situation where Vladimir Putin faced such incredible personal risk as he does today. And that's the thing he worries about. There's a reason this guy's been locked away in his cellar, in his dungeon, trying to avoid coming out in public. He's recently fled events in places like Novosibirsk, which are located about 1,000 kilometers, I would guesstimate, from Ukraine. He's fleeing these events because he's worried about Ukrainian drones. But more than that, from all the evidence that's come out, he's worried about the other elites. He's worried about other people who realize that his time might have come to an end and he needs to act decisively. But he's not able to act decisively because he doesn't have money to make decisions. And he can order somebody to go, fight with some other group or to seize their assets. But every time you do that, you are taking a risk. How about if that forced takeover, that unexpected merger and acquisition that was supposed to go down, doesn't go down the way you wanted it to? All of a sudden you have, gang war breaking out. Is that possible? Yes, actually, Russian history would also indicate that can definitely start up at times that nobody expected it. Right, so I think the situation in Russia, Chuck, is getting far more complicated. And everyone's just joining us. Make sure that you subscribe right now, and make sure to check out our Substack article, which is located in the first pinned comment, along with the link to help the Ukrainian soldiers. Chuck, great talk with you as always.
Thank you, Jason.